Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today's session is it's one of our Cultivating Learning sessions, and it's called Enhancing Storytelling with Digital Museum Objects. And today we'll explore all kinds of techniques to enhance storybook reading with museum objects and engagement activities to help storybooks come alive for young learners. Today's session is one of several. This is a Cultivating Learning session in which we feature educators as they model techniques for using digital museum resources to support student learning in a whole variety of learning environments. So I'm joined today with Maureen Leary. Hold on, I think I passed too quickly through our names. Sorry about that. So I'm joined today with Maureen Leary, who is the Early Learning Programs Manager at the National Postal Museum. And Maureen also used to work at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center. So she brings more than 2 decades of experience working with early learners. Okay. So let me tell you about the session. This is one of several that we offer in October. You can see our whole series here. We have online office hours. We have a series that I do with Tess Porter, who's an educator in the Office of Educational Technology. And we have a Getting Started and also a Creating Collections series. So the next Creating Collections is coming up toward the end of the month on October 26th. We also have a session next week, October 19th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard. And that one will be led by Tess Porter with, I have to see my screen a little better, with Doris Sung, who is the 2021 National Design Award winner. And that's with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. So that will be another really amazing session. The Smithsonian Learning Lab is a free online platform where you can discover digital museum resources from across the Smithsonian and beyond. You can create interactive learning experiences with them, and then you can share your discoveries and creations with others. So we'll be sharing a few resources on the lab today that Maureen has put together from the National Postal Museum, and you can find those links. I'll put those in the chat as we get to the resources. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Help Center. So this is the help page of the Learning Lab, and I'll put that link in the chat. Here's a place where you can find upcoming webinars, archived webinars. You can find step-by-step instructions how to use the Learning Lab, and from researching to actually building collections. Today's session is meant to be interactive, so please put your comments and questions in the chat over on the far right if you're joining us today by YouTube, or in the comment section if you're joining us by Facebook. That's down in the bottom center of your page. So to get us started today, we invite you to answer the following question. What's the value of reading books with children? And as you put your comments in the chat, and Maureen will also describe another way that you can share your comments, I'll turn it over to Maureen. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Philippa. And I'm also going to ask Philippa to walk us through the other way that I would love for you to share your comments with us. So we're going to use the platform called Padlet, which some of you may be familiar with already. And I think Philippa's going to put the link in the chat for us. And she also is going to walk us through how to comment on Padlet. It's very simple. And we wanted to give you an additional way to comment on this prompt that we gave, just to accommodate people who maybe might not be comfortable attaching their name to a comment, might feel a little self-conscious about commenting in a public forum for whatever reason. Maybe you have a lot you want to share and you don't necessarily want to hog the chat. So you can feel free to comment anonymously here on the Padlet link. So the way that you do that, which I think Philippa can show us, is you go to the little pink plus sign on the circle with the plus sign in it on the bottom. You click on that, and you go down to where it says write something fantastic or beautiful or whatever prompt you get, and you just write your comment there. We already put a test one in that said, I love books, I love reading with my son, is what Flip is telling us. And then as soon as you finish writing your comment, you just hit publish, and then you are able to move that comment wherever on the screen you would like it to appear. So it's really simple, and as I said, it's anonymous. And it's just another way to engage with the audience. So we thought we'd give you a couple options for commenting today. And I'm excited. I see a couple comments coming in. Thank you to those of you who are jumping right in and trying that with us. So I'm now going to actually, while you all are filling in some answers there and also in the chat, I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint for a moment, and we will come back to this in a minute. But while you're doing that, I would love to just tell you a little bit more about the Postal Museum and about our program today. So our museum explores the history of the Postal Service, including stamps and mail delivery and all the people and things that have played a part in that. We are one of the smaller museums at the Smithsonian, but we have the second largest collection with almost 6 million objects. A lot of those objects are stamps, but we have so much more as well. We are located near the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. So while we are not on the National Mall with most of the Smithsonian museums, we are very nearby. So today we're going to have a brief learning experience that's based on one of the programs that I do for the Postal Museum. Every other Monday, I offer a live virtual story time with learners who are usually about ages 3 to 7. This virtual version of the program was instituted once we had to close due to the pandemic. We are still doing it. We are not offering in-person programs yet. But we will likely continue offering virtual programs even once we return to in-person programs, because they have some benefits to them and have been very successful in their own way. So when I do these live sessions, I always explore a few museum objects from our collection, and then I'll read a book that's related to the topic. And then we'll always do some kind of follow-up activity as well, which is often an art activity, not always. And then we will conclude by sharing out either the work that the children did or an item they brought to share, or thoughts they have about the topic, questions, whatever it is. So today we will walk through a version of a program that I recently held that I've modified for this adult audience. Before we do that, I will return quickly to our Padlet answers and see what we have there in the Padlet. Thanks, Philippa. So we have a few things in there. Develop language skills, so many values, building vocabulary skills, promoting children's imagination and creativity, the wonder and curiosity children experience, intimacy. That's a great one that I think it's a little harder to cultivate in over a virtual space, but in person for sure. Adult and child sharing the same story in the same space is really special. So thank you. I love all these comments, and we will come back to these again at the end as we kind of wrap up and tie things together. So I'm also going to quickly see, it looks like we have one comment in the chat about also building vocabulary skills and having fun, supporting reading. So thank you for all of those. And I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint now, but I'm going to ask you one more question. And this one you can just use the chat for. This is a really simple question. What comes to mind when I say the word postcards? So you can just put your answers in the chat. And this is just a really broad, open-ended question. It's the kind of question I like to start with in all my programs. Sometimes I'll use a more structured thinking routine. I really like the ones that are developed by Harvard's Project Zero that encourage really close looking and careful thinking. And I think Philippa is going to put a link in the chat to that too. I think to, if you want to learn more about the Harvard Project Zero thinking routines, but really anything that gets the discussion going and can start to sort of tease out what the kids are thinking and what they already know or think about a topic is really useful for framing a learning experience. I just find it to be a really good warm-up. And, it's also a way to let the thinking of the children direct the flow of the program a little bit too, to give them a little bit of agency in how the program goes. So, there are no right or wrong answers. We work together to construct a definition. We're finding out the level of base knowledge, and we're all just getting into an open learning mindset together. And by writing down what the kids, what they think about this prompt that I'm showing them, it shows them that their thinking is really valued, what they're saying is important. And then, of course, there's also the added bonus that by doing that, by writing the words out on a screen for them, it's also a great literacy building strategy. So I'll often use a whiteboard on Zoom, or sometimes I'll use a Jamboard on Google. There's different platforms you can use. But just doing that physical act of writing it out, typing it out, and showing them the words that they've said and sharing those words with each other can be really powerful and has a lot of benefits to it. So just looking to see what answers we have in the chat. I think of sending letters to friends and collecting images I like. Love, friends, vacations, smiles, souvenirs, traveling, a short note or greeting with an image. This is pre-technology days, similar to today's Twitter messages or texting, Snapchat, etc. I feel like somebody had a sneak peek at my notes with that one, with that comment. So absolutely. I totally agree with all of these comments. And I will say nowadays, we mostly think of postcards as souvenirs. Maybe something you buy to help you remember an experience you had, or to share part of that experience with someone else that you mail it to. But postcards actually have a really interesting and important history behind them. The study and collecting of postcards even has its own word, just like we have, the study of fossils is paleontology, the study of the earth is geology, the study of and collecting of postcards is deltiology. And this comes from the Greek word deltion, which means small writing tablet, which I just found a delightful little fun fact. So moving on to our next slide. The idea for postcards with an address on one side and a message on the other first came about in Europe about in the 1860s. And there was a lot of resistance to approving them for use initially because of privacy concerns. But once they finally were introduced and the government said, okay, they caught on immediately. The first postcards were issued by the US government about 150 years ago, and it only cost 1 cent to mail them, as you can see on the screen here. And they instantly became really popular as an inexpensive way to send messages. So at this time in history, telephones had only recently been invented and weren't really common yet. So sending a postcard was often the fastest, easiest, and least expensive way to get a message to someone quickly. So in a sense, they really revolutionized communication between friends and family in much the same way social media and electronic communication has in modern times, like the comment we saw in the chat a little while ago. All right. So I'm going to ask you to go back to the chat again, and I'm going to say, does anybody want to make a guess as to what the building on this postcard is? I'll give you a moment to see if anybody has a thought about this. You can see that it says at the top, New Post Office, Washington, D.C. And if you look for some more clues, you can probably tell that it is not a new picture. Based on, there's an old automobile in the front. If you look really closely, you can see a horse and buggy in the back right next to the building. So I'll give you another really big hint. I've already shown you a picture of this building. So I don't see any guesses in the chat yet. I will go ahead and tell you this building is a postcard of what is now the National Postal Museum when it was first finished in 1914. So it was a really exciting event when this post office first opened. You can see it's very large, much larger than I think we are used to seeing post offices be today. And for decades, it served as the central post office for Washington, D.C. And it's strategically located right next to Union Station, which is DC's central train station. Because at the time that it was built, that was primarily how mail was moved across the country. It came in and out of the city on trains. So to go to our next slide, this is just another angle of the same building. And I just wanted to show you this one because we have, this is now a picture that we have on a postcard that we give away for free at the museum. And it's actually very popular with our visitors. And buildings and places are a really common theme to see on postcards, still today, but throughout history of postcards. And there's a pretty substantial collection of postcards to do with Smithsonian museums from different points in their history. And you can learn a lot about those historic postcards through those historic postcards because the Smithsonian Museum has the collection and the buildings and they themselves have changed a lot over the years. The buildings have had different roles as the Smithsonian has grown in keeping with, the enormous growth of the collection. And so some of those things you can learn just by looking at old postcards and seeing how the names have changed and the uses of the buildings have changed. So it's kind of another fun fact. And here is a building that may be familiar to a lot of you. It is commonly called the Castle, but its official name is the Smithsonian Institution Building. It stands on the National Mall today and is considered to be sort of a central office for the Smithsonian Institution. The way this image looks makes me think it's pretty old. And again, you can see it looks like a old-fashioned car there in the front. People walking, you can tell, if you can see that close up, it's very small, but they look like they've got on some old-fashioned dress. So we can use some clues to tell us how old this postcard might be. But we can also look on the back and see what else we can find out. So you can see that there's some writing here on the top left. It gives us a little snippet of information about the Smithsonian, and that's typical of what you would find on a modern postcard. Usually you'll have a little bit of information on this side, and that tells you about the image on the front. But that actually wasn't always the case. In fact, before an act of Congress changed this as of March 1st, 1907, postcards were not even allowed to have writing on the back. So there were both national and international regulations that dictated that the only thing that was allowed on the back was the mailing address. So any messages for the recipient had to go on the front of the card, which is, of course, the opposite of what we're used to now. So you can see by this small notation on the bottom, it says post-1906, that this postcard has been dated as being from 1907 or later. And that's because this card clearly has one half set aside for the address with room on the other side for the message. You can also see that it was issued at a time when postage was still 1 cent for domestic addresses and 2 cents for foreign. So in the early 1900s, the rate fluctuated between 1 and 2 cents, but it didn't consistently stay any higher until 1953 when it was raised to 3 cents. So even just these few simple details on this image can give us some really good historical clues or information about this object and our topic. And so this kind of exercise of looking for these clues and talking about what these little things mean can really help kids with building those historical thinking skills that will serve them so well as they move on through school and life. So after giving a little bit of history of postcards, when I did this program with my young audience, I also included a couple cards that might resonate with them a little bit more than pictures of old buildings. So the images I'm using with you today are somewhat different than the ones I chose from my young audience, but I did want to share this particular example with you. With this one, I wanted to give them a sense of how postcards from different times in history can give us clues as to what was going on at that time. And postcards really are an incredibly important primary source for historians. They provide insight into both the physical and social world of bygone times, and they can be used to study a wide variety of topics. So this is obviously a teddy bear, but not just any teddy bear. This is a postcard of the original teddy bear named after President Theodore Roosevelt, and it is in the collection at the National Museum of American History. The teddy bear became a big thing in popular culture in 1902 after there was a story in the Washington Post about Teddy Roosevelt going hunting and refusing to shoot a bear that was tied up because he thought that it was unsportsmanlike. So the public caught on to this story, and then an enterprising toy maker marketed a bear called Teddy's Bear. And after Roosevelt gave his blessing to use the name, this toy became very popular. And the original bear was eventually given to Roosevelt's family, who donated it to the Smithsonian in the 1960s. So again, this is a topic that might resonate a little bit more with children, and it gives them some way of thinking about postcards that's a little bit more concrete and connected to their own lives, but it also has a good story behind it. And just for fun and some added context for all of you, I put this image in, although this is not one I shared with my young audience. This postcard's from 1907, by which time the term teddy bear had found its way into a series of children's books by Seymour Eaton. And this image shows Teddy B and Teddy G, the Roosevelt Bears, with a caption that reads, "The Roosevelt Bears at Washington. With outstretched hand and smiling face, he gave them welcome to the place." So these illustrations of Roosevelt's bears were so well liked in popular culture that they were issued as postcards that were marketed to adults. So another cool aspect of postcard history is that they were often used as a substitute for or an enhancement of spreading news through newspapers. The postcards came into their heyday at a time before newspapers commonly included photos in their news stories. So postcards became a way of giving people access to photos or drawings of important events. So the early 1900s are referred to as the golden age of postcards. And in the years between 1905 and 1915, nearly 1 billion postcards per year were mailed in the US. And anytime something big or exciting happened, a photographer would show up and document it, and then it could easily become a postcard, either with the photo itself or an artistic rendering of it, which is what we see here. So in this example, we have a postcard of the Titanic before it set sail, which of course was a huge event with a lot of fanfare around it. But we all know what happened with the Titanic. And as it turns out, a postcard was issued post-sinking that acknowledged that event. Here you can see the bits of iceberg there in the water with the boat, and it gave some information about what happened there. So, and as an aside, the full name of the ship was RMS Titanic, Royal Mail Steamship Titanic. The ship was officially commissioned by both the British monarchy and the U.S. government to carry mail. So we have a lot of great content about it at the Postal Museum if you're interested in that subject. This image is another example of a disaster featured on a postcard. This is a mail train wreck that was photographed and put onto a postcard to be shared with the public. So fortunately, no one was seriously injured in this wreck, but it still seems to me to be an odd choice for a postcard subject when thinking about it in a modern context. And I imagine probably seems that way to some of you as well. A comparison that jumps to mind for me is the idea of making a postcard from the wreckage of the 9/11 attacks, which of course we just celebrated just marked the 20th anniversary of. And although those images were of course widely published as news, it's really hard to imagine seeing them memorialized on a postcard, at least certainly not at that time when it happened. That was not a way that people would want to see those images used. But this was really common back in 1908 when this particular postcard was published. It was just a way that people were able to see for themselves things that had happened when they couldn't see those images through the media the way that we are used to. So, oops, went too fast there. So these are just a few postcard themes that we've looked at, and there are so many more. One that I want to talk about as we continue our learning together is putting art on postcards. In modern times, that's probably one of the most common usages of postcards. And when I did my program with my young audience, we read a book that ties that idea into my overall topic really beautifully. So we're not going to read this whole book together, but I will give you a quick summary of it. And first, I just want to mention a few techniques that I use when reading to both keep my audience engaged and to help connect my objects to the story. So instead of reading the text straight through, I'll often stop and ask questions while I'm reading, and I'll do that to check for understanding or to emphasize content. And it's just also a nice way to just encourage participation and make sure we child gets to have their voice heard if they desire that. If I'm doing a virtual program and using a PowerPoint, I use a lot of animations to keep things interesting or to highlight things. I've definitely developed a lot of new PowerPoint skills throughout the pandemic. But if you're in person, you can always stop and emphasize something in the script or point out something in an image. Just, using those really easy strategies to highlight things and make sure that you're, reinforcing that connection that you really want the kids to pick up on, and just help cement that understanding. It's always fun to incorporate movement when you can, getting other senses involved and getting the body involved, bringing in the different styles of learning. Always great to do. A lot easier in person, I have found, than in a virtual setting. I've tried it a few times. Not as successful as in person usually, but never hurts to try it. And finally, just making things sort of fun and exciting and using a little bit of mystery or what's going to happen next, guessing, asking the kids for predictions. This, again, is a good way to just sort of gauge where their understanding is. If they can make a pretty solid prediction about what might happen next, then it's usually an indication that they've been able to keep up with the content up to that point. So these are strategies that, of course, can enhance any kind of story time, but I find it really helps when you're using a book as a part of a larger learning experience, and you really do want to reinforce that content that you started with. Books, of course, can be a standalone activity. They don't necessarily need to have lots of things going on as a structure to it, but if you do want to emphasize particular content while reading a book, I have found it's really effective to try to weave it in as much as possible while you're reading, as long as you're not interrupting the narrative flow too much. So this title, the title of this book is Look, Look, Look by Nancy Elizabeth Wallace and Linda K. Friedlander. And in this story, 3 mice find a postcard that's delivered to the house where they live. They're really curious about it, so they take it and they have a close look at it. And one of the opening pages of the book gave me the opportunity to, again, review the components of a postcard. We have a stamp. We have an address where the postcard is going. We have a little bit of information about what we find on the front of the postcard. And of course, we have a message to the people the postcard is being sent to. So the mice take this postcard and they make a point of having a really close look at it, which as a museum educator, I find really delightful. They look the postcard up and down and side to side and look really closely at the details. And then they get inspired after they've taken a really close look in different ways. Then they get inspired and they decide they're going to do some artwork based on the painting that they've spent all this time looking at. And they work together, they take turns, they do this art in several different ways. And finally, the family comes home and they have to scurry to put the postcard back. And then it's the family's turn to look at the postcard at the end. And I really, really loved how this book tied directly to the topic that I was exploring with the kids, but it also opened up another avenue. And the way that it encourages close looking and then finding inspiration from that is really wonderful for both museum and classroom educators and learning contexts. I love using books in my programs just because they can be a really effective avenue for imparting content in an engaging way. They can provide lots of entry points into your topic or jumping off points for extending that learning. So after finishing this story, we extended our learning with this idea of art being on postcards. And I imagine we've all seen plenty of postcards in our time with art on them, either in museums or souvenir shops, lots of places. We continued our exploration by looking at a postcard with art by the very famous artist, Alexander Calder. And I really enjoy exploring Alexander Calder with young children because his art is often so whimsical. It's sometimes abstract and sometimes more representational, but I find that for children, it's usually very engaging and really draws them in. So there's no title for this artwork given, but it's a really fun shape that could be a lot of things. And what I find really cool about this postcard is that it was sent by Alexander Calder to Joseph Hirshhorn, who is the founding donor of the Hirshhorn Museum, which is the part of the Smithsonian where we have Calder's work in the collection. And he used this postcard to write this breezy note to his friend Joseph Hirshhorn, inviting him to come visit him in Connecticut. It's very hard to read his handwriting, but it says, "We're here for a bit. When are you coming up? Cordially, Calder." And so it's really interesting to me that he used this as sort of a means of self-promotion by choosing to mail a postcard with his own art on it. But it was fun, just to use this piece as a segue between the idea of the history and the importance of postcards, and then the practice of looking more closely at one postcard or one artist's work, and then using that for inspiration, just like the mice did in the story. So here are some more examples of Alexander Calder artwork on postcards. These are not ones from the Smithsonian collection. These were just ones that I was able to find online. But you can see that, as I said, very whimsical, colorful, lots of shapes and lines. For me, this is just, really gets the imagination going. And I also was excited to use Alexander Calder's work with the children because we have a nice connection to him at the Postal Museum, because we have postage stamps in our collection with his artwork on it, as you can see here. And these feature his mobiles and staybills rather than his paintings and drawings. So it's a little bit more of a range of his artwork, but again, just lots of fun lines and shapes and really imaginative images. And finally, I will show you a few more pieces of Calder's art that are in the Smithsonian collection. And I just want you to take a moment here and just take a look and think about how looking closely at these pieces might help you find inspiration to create your own artwork. With my young audience, I asked them to come to the program with some materials to make their own postcards. And I left these pictures up on the screen while I played some music and gave them some time to create. And then when that was finished, we had time for sharing. And this is always my favorite part of the program, where I get to see their creativity in action. And frequently their work really does display evidence of them having synthesized the things that we've talked about. It's always totally optional for them to share their work. And whatever they say or they share, I try to find a way to, validate that, connect it to something that we've learned, or maybe something else another child has said. If you work with young children, you know that this is unpredictable. Things will veer off in a really different direction. And it can be challenging to connect back to what your topic is. But I'll always make a point of saying something like, "Wow, it sounds like you're really interested in that topic. Maybe we can learn about that one next time." Just anything that, as I said, validates whatever their perspective is, wherever they're coming from on this. And I always try to make sure too that it's open-ended enough that the kids feel like they can go in a direction that they want to. And if they don't want to do it, that's fine too. They can just listen to the music and listen to other kids share. We try to make it a very non-stressful, non-pressured environment for the kids. So, all right, so that is the end of my screen share. But before I wrap up, I want to ask all of you. So we started with the question of what is the value of reading books with children? So I want to follow that up now. And we'll go back to the Padlet for this one. You can also use the chat. So what do you see where the value is in using museum objects together with books with children? What connections do you see between using objects and books together? So I would love it if you wanted to fill something in on the Padlet, and I will go ahead and make a little more space. Oh, maybe I can't. I was trying to move some of these comments over, but I think people can only move their own comments over. It looks like there's still plenty of space there. If anybody would like to put a comment in, would love to see. I see a few people in there. Maybe we'll get some comments. And of course, also the chat is wide open for that. And I hope that, in kind of walking through this exercise, this activity with all of you, that you've seen what some of these connections might be, how objects and books can go hand in hand and really support each other in the learning with children. And as we're waiting for some comments to come in, I will just make my own comment that I, as an educator who's been in this field for over 20 years, I have been so gratified to see that the the diversity of choices that we have for children's books has just improved dramatically over the past couple of decades. I'd say probably mostly over the past maybe 10 years. Just so many more topics that are inclusive, tackling difficult issues, showing family situations and all different kinds of things that you didn't ever used to see in mainstream children's books. So that's really encouraging and very, very helpful if you're trying to be sensitive to who your audience is and making sure that children see themselves represented in the books and the objects that you're using. So I do see a couple of comments coming in. I see that using them together can promote close looking, reasoning with evidence, which relates to literacy skills. Absolutely. This is one of the big things for me is I think you really can use museum objects, particularly when you're pairing them with a book, to help develop literacy skills, which is what makes it so great to do it with those kids who are those emergent readers, who are just learning all of those really critical skills to become proficient readers. You can really reinforce a lot of those skills with using museum objects paired with books. So I see books, abstract experience, museum objects makes it tactile and visual, sensory. Yeah, children might have an idea of books as authorities, so using books and objects as sources help kids feel honored by contact with objects. So I'm so glad that comment came in, because I do think that that's really important sort of underpinning of this whole thing is that when we show a museum object to children, we're giving that object inherent value, right? If it's something that someone has chosen to be in a museum, it must be important for some reason, right? So then when you take that object and you say, look, this object connects with this book, and this book connects with your life, you're creating that through line for them. That's not only showing them the importance of the object itself or the topic itself, but how they fit into all of that and how they're important too. And the experiences that they bring to it and that they take away from it, all of that has value. And making those connections for them is part of what's so important about doing these kinds of things with young children. And I see we have a comment in the chat too. I think the combination of using objects and books helps provide context for young learners. Yeah, totally. Thank you, Kat, for that comment. And I think that goes along with what I was just saying. So just, again, like the more that you can do to sort of reinforce a concept and show it to children in different ways and show it to them in ways where they understand the importance of what you're showing them as much as they can, that is always really helpful. So I'm waiting to see if we have any more anything else coming into the chat, but another comment I wanted to make sure that I made was getting back to this idea of building historical thinking skills. I personally do think that's one of the main reasons I like to use museum objects with books, is because history is something that can be pretty abstract for young kids, and bit by bit, piece by piece, we can kind of break it down and make that easier for them to absorb and understand. And so, I threw a lot of dates out there when we were talking today, 1902, 1907. I didn't have to give you all context for what those dates mean. But when I'm working with young children, I always try to do that because I don't expect them to know what 1902 means, compared to 2021 or, so I usually try to say something like, instead of giving the year, I might say, well, this was over 100 years ago when this happened. And this was before any of us were alive. This is before any of your grandparents were alive. This was before there were cars on the road, even, something that might give them a little bit more of an understanding than just throwing a year out there. That I find is really helpful. And I've done an evaluation survey for my program, and I've had parents comment and say that they really value the pairing of the history and the learning with this just sort of pleasure of reading a story, and that their kids will talk about it after and how they feel proud to know all the history of the Postal Service or whatever the topic is. So it's been really rewarding and validating. And I hope that I've provided some resources or inspiration for you today. As I said before, I do think that we're really lucky in modern times that you can find great books to go along with these objects in the Smithsonian collection or other museum collections, because there is so much diversity there in both kinds of resources. and ways to be inclusive, and the ways that you can branch off and respond to different specific interests while still finding ways to really directly and meaningfully connect with your audience and provide a child-centered experience. I mean, it's really limitless and really, I think, exciting as an educator to kind of delve into all of that. So for me, in this instance, it was the book that sparked the topic. I thought it was a really excellent book to use. So I just started researching postcards to see what I would come up with. And it turned out it was a surprisingly interesting topic for me and for my audience. And I was able to find a lot of good connections to make. So finding those stories behind your chosen objects and those curriculum connections or topic connections is just really such an engaging process to go through as an educator, and also to walk your learners through with you. So thank you all for your time and attention today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Philippa.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I wish I had a young child nearby. I want to just read stories. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And while we're waiting to see if questions come in, Maureen, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the Learning Lab collection that you created.
Sure.
And then also some of the offerings that you have from the museum.
Absolutely.
So here, I just put the link into the chat of the collection, and here is the actual collection.
Great. Yeah, thank you. If you want to share that on the screen. So yeah, this is, I just gave a little bit of context at the top of the collection there that is, I think, similar to some of the things I went over in our program today. I didn't go too text heavy on this one. This is really more about the objects, but it's just sort of a nice jumping off point to explore all these different ways that postcards have been used throughout history. Some of them we talked about, some of them we didn't, but places, events, objects, advertisements, causes, politics, and art. I think those are all the topics I put in there. And this is just a really tiny sampling of what you can find on the Learning Lab as far as all these different topics go. And some of these are ways postcards have been used historically. Some are ways that they're used in more modern times. And then there's some resources at the bottom that I think also give a lot more context for this whole topic. A couple of sort of timelines and history of postcards, and then some resources from the National Postal Museum, which delve into certain aspects of postcards a bit more in ways that the museum has used them either for an online exhibit or an ongoing program, different approaches that we've taken at the museum to exploring that. And then I will add these links. These links are not in the description at the top yet, but I will add them after the program. Just for everyone's awareness, as I mentioned, I do have my Storytime program that happens every other Monday. And I do invite anybody to join as an observer. We actually have that happen quite often. It's a Zoom meeting, so participants can be on camera and participate, but certainly plenty of people leave their cameras off, stay muted. So if you just want to come in and kind of be a fly on the wall and see this in action with kids, you are more than welcome. The registration link is now in the chat. And as I said, I will also add it to the collection. I do also have a series of sort of more evergreen resources that videos series that I do called Stamp Stories, which again is using children's books to connect with museum objects. Every month it's a different theme, something that you find on postage stamps. And I always work with another educator at a different Smithsonian unit. And so we bring in objects from the other unit and then look at the stamps, and we read a children's book that ties it all together. And so I have, I think, 10 of those that I've done now. And so the link to find those is also in the chat. And we also have, of course, a Learning Lab page for the National Postal Museum, where we have all kinds of things that you can find that are related to the postal history, which I have become very fascinated by in my time at the museum.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Maureen. I'm going to repost just one link there. It says it didn't go through to Facebook, which is the link for the Storytime registration, but you should have everything else. And I don't see that any questions have come in. So is there anything else that we need to share with everyone? I just think it was so informative today, and my mind is buzzing with ideas, not actually not just for young learners, but I think, right, you could adapt some of these ideas for older learners too, outside of story time.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And that's part of why I was kind of eager to adapt this for an adult audience, because just to show that it really is adaptable in that way, and that I did change some of my content that I thought would make it a little more interesting for an adult audience. But I have certainly also gotten the comment from families that, you know, these programs where we pull in these objects and all the information and stories behind them turn out to be really interesting and stimulating for the whole family, which is always great to hear. So yeah,
That's
so many
great.
connections you can make across all ages and disciplines. So
Well, thank you so, so much, Maureen. It's been really a pleasure to share these 45 minutes with you.
yeah, well,
I'd
thank you
like,
for having me. I appreciate being here.
and I'd like to just remind people, please join us. We have 2 more sessions this month. Next week, we'll have a Teaching with Design session called Taking Action on Climate Change with the Cooper Hewitt Museum and Dara Sung, who's the 2021 National Design Award winner, and also a session called Creating Collections on Tuesday, October 26th. So you can find all of that content at our Help Center, as well as links for helping you learn to use the Learning Lab and also any upcoming or archived sessions. So thank you so much for being here, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.